Oh, here it is.
Good. We always do this on Zoom, don't we? So welcome to Mythology. I'm Dr. Maria Kempinska. I'm a psychotherapist. I also have trained in the theatre. Also in business, in the world of comedy, but also in my work with my clients. I love the idea of mythology to be part of the representation of how our psyche works, but we won't go into that just at the moment. But I'm in discussion with my colleague and friend Anastasios Gaitonides, who is Greek, and who else is there better than you to talk about this with me. We're speaking about your chosen play called Antigone, and it's one of Sophocles' plays, the third Theban play. And first of all, let me ask you, a little bit about your background and why you chose this play.
I'm a relational psychoanalyst, trained both in the UK and the US, in New York, in relational psychoanalysis. And I've been practicing, I've been in private practice for 20 years, more than 20 years. I'm also working as a lecturer at Regent's University London. I'm a visiting professor there, and the University of Roehampton, training psychotherapists, counseling psychologists, and psychoanalysts, and deliver lectures at the site for contemporary psychoanalysis. I'm particularly fond of this myth, Antigone, and I've chosen it today for our first discussion, hopefully in a series of discussions about myths, because represents for me something very crucial for our times. How do we find our own voice? How do we stand up against unfair and unjust authority? How do we speak against the people that rule us when the laws that they invent are not ethical, and they speak against our conscience? And I think Antigone is the prime example of resistance against the law. A law that is man-made against the divine law that she represents, the law of the gods.
There's so many themes, and that's fantastic. What might be a good idea is let's just start with the play, if you can give a synopsis of the play, and then go into more detail and break it down a little bit. And why is it so effective and so pertinent, and actually maybe something that people can think about? This is a wonderful representation. That's what theatre is all about, isn't it? To reflect on our world, to give us those. And Sophocles was so good about that. He was a military man. This is one of his, tragedies. And he wanted to evoke that response from people, that question. But at the time he wrote it, which is quite a long time ago, which is about 5 centuries BC, sort of they still had that very strong power and decision-making process, but very different lifestyle than we have. The society was very different. But let's go back to the story, the myth, the play, and you can give an overview.
I think this is the third you mentioned of the Theban plays that Sophocles has written. The first one was Oedipus Rex, the second one is Oedipus at Colonus, and the third one is Antigone. So the first one deals with Oedipus, the story of Oedipus, the one who kills his father and marries his mother.
Unwittingly, though.
Unwittingly.
Yes,
And that is very important.
But that's another story.
That's another story. And then the Oedipus at Colonus is the story of Oedipus after he punishes himself for finding the truth about what he's done and plugs his eyes out. And he feels quite penitent and guilty, and we see him in his full humanity and vulnerability at Oedipus at Colonus, and followed by Antigone, his loyal and daughter, who is follow him around and is more or less his guide because he doesn't have eyes to see. And the third one is Antigone, which is the story of Oedipus' daughter. But but before we arrive at here and the story, there is also a background of the story itself. So um, um, after Oedipus' death, Creon, who is her uncle, and actually is the brother-in-law, actually, the brother-in-law of Oedipus, is a caretaker king. But but then the sons of Oedipus, Eteocles and Polynices, are fighting for. They are the rightful heirs of the throne. They are supposed to take over. However, they decide that because they want both to share the power, that Eteocles will go first and will do he will reign first for a year, and then he will pass the reign to Polynices. Eteocles, however, decides not to do that, not to pass the power back to, because he finds that why should I do that since I get all the power and I command everything. And then Polynices finds that this is unfair, and and a war, and he sides against the enemies of Thebes, and he uses the power to overthrow his brother and take the power from him. And they engage in a war that lasts for years, and eventually they engage in a fight and they kill each other in this fight. They both die. And of course, after their death, Creon becomes the rightful king, the only sort of successful sort of successor to the throne, since both of the male heirs of Oedipus are now dead. So Creon becomes the king, and the two daughters of Oedipus, which is Antigone and Ismene, are still part of the royal court. And Antigone, is supposed to marry his son, Haemon, and they get engaged. They get engaged. So Antigone and Haemon, which is the son of Creon, are engaged. Now, Antigone herself is very independent and very free-spirited, and she often has, conflicts with Creon's authority. But more importantly, that comes into prominence when Creon decides that only Eteocles, one of the brothers, who was the king of Thebes while the war started, will be buried, and the ritual libations and the burial ritual will be performed for Eteocles, but more for Polynices, because he sided against the enemies of Thebes, and in order to overthrow his brother and take the power. So no burial rites will be performed for him. He will be considered a traitor and an enemy of the city, and he will be left unburied. Now, that is a big deal for Antigone, who realizes that this is fundamentally unjust, unfair, is a decree, is an arbitrary decree of Creon and his power as a king, as the new tyrant of the city, and she decides she has an argument against this with Creon, trying to convince him. He decides that there is no way that he's going to give in to her demands, so she decides to do this secretly against Creon's wishes. And of course, Creon has already ordered that whoever performs this ritual, he will have to be executed, because this is the will of the king, this is the will of the city. Everybody that goes against and performs a burial ritual for Polynices is a traitor, like Polynices was, so he will have to be arrested for treason and executed. So Antigone, disobeys. It's a matter of civil disobedience. This one disobeys Creon's will, and she decides to perform the burial rituals, which were not complicated. She did it in a matter of seconds. Really, you just need to throw a bit of dust on top of the body and say a couple of prayers and offer some libations to the gods. I mean, this would have taken a couple of minutes. So she does this, and she avoids to escape being captured the first time she does. by the guards who are guarding the body because they were afraid that someone will disobey Creon. So she avoids capture, but what happens? The guards realize that happened and report that to Creon. And Creon says, "Well, remove the earth and the dust from the Polynesia's body, and so as to undo the ritual." And what she realizes once this, she goes and does it again. It's not just she did it the first time. In a way, the first time she's already made the offerings and she performed the ritual. She didn't need to go and repeat it, but she goes and does it again, second time, and the second time she's captured. And she's captured by the guards, and she's presented to Creon. Who Creon, feels really upset that she disobeyed him, and decides to arrest her and bury her alive. It was quite a harsh punishment. And of course, the chorus in the play, initially supports Creon in his decision to be very firm about this, but gradually changes its mind and tries to convince him, together with the first sort of chorister, to convince him to change his mind, because this harsh decision is going to bring more grief to him and the city. To do this to Antigone, but Antigone is unapologetic. She says, "I have nothing to apologize. I'm not going to relent. Or repent. What I've done is right by the gods, and that's the higher authority than your authority, which is only human." And she's buried alive, and she takes her life while she's in the tomb. She hangs herself, and Aemon, who in the meantime tries to convince Creon to free Antigone, he also finds her hanged and dead, and he commits suicide himself, because of his heartbreak. So Creon loses his son, as well as finds the whole city against him, and his wife as well, who tried to convince him not to be so absolute and so very sort of tyrannical in his decision. She also decides to leave him. So there is in Creon becomes very solitary at the end of this tragedy, and is not being seen in a very good light at the end of that affair. But you can see how Antigone, in a way, is there are several sort of meanings and ideas we can draw from this tragedy. Certainly, yeah.
I mean, you've got the theme of power, absolute power.
Yeah.
Leadership today, as you said. So you've not only got leadership in families, but leadership at work, and then social, political leadership.
Yes.
You've got gender, which we're talking about here. But I think we're talking more about the energy of masculine and feminine, in the psychological energies, which I much prefer to talk about, rather than gender specific. And I think this is where people are getting a little bit confused today. We've got morality. What is the right thing to do here on earth? We've also got the divine law. You didn't mention Tiresias.
Yes.
Because I always wonder, because if you can explain what he did, what his role was, because Tiresias actually flows through a lot of the classical literature, doesn't he?
Yes, I think he's always very decisive and very instrumental in any of these. For example, with Oedipus, he's already the one who warns him and says, "You are the cause of the plague of this city." And Oedipus doesn't believe him. He believes he's a traitor that plans with Creon to overthrow him and overthrow his power. And but in that moment, Tiresias returns back and says that, I might be blind, but you cannot see, you cannot hear, and you cannot feel what is right in front of you.
Yeah, and he is a prophet and a seer.
A prophet and a seer, yeah.
But isn't it more? I like the role of Tiresias, because we miss these people today. I mean, let's talk about him as a character, that why does he replay all the time? Because he tells us, he's almost in connection between us and the divine law and God.
Yes.
In a way, isn't he? He's a representative of God. He's not just a tarot reader. And I'm not saying tarot readers can't be good or anything, but they're more than that. He's more than that. He embodies something much more spiritual as well. He can actually see what's right and wrong morally, divine, in the divine law of humanity here.
I think Tiresias is absolutely crucial in the whole sort of trilogy. He's and in this instance, he warns Creon against his absolute decision, the absolute decision of absolute power. That he need to be flexible, that this is not the time to reinforce the law of the city because the gods will be displeased with him. And he says that to him directly. And I think he's already, Creon, to his credit, he's listening to Tiresias. He's not discrediting it, although initially he disagrees. Eventually he's convinced otherwise. But then instead of going to free Antigone up, and he's trying in a way to perform the burial ritual of Polynices. I mean, he's not quite doing the right thing by Antigone either. He's too late, and then the tragedy of Antigone killing herself and Hammon following suit is he doesn't prohibit it. So in many ways, again, he decides to listen to the people, the chorus and the chorister and Tiresias, but he does it in a way that still reinforces his own authority and his own ego. And not, following the will of God.
It's quite interesting. So if you take it step by step, so Creon at the beginning of the play is not a real leader as such. He's the regent. He's looking after everything. The two brothers fight, which is very common in the Bible, in Shakespeare, you name it, in all the classics. Two brothers fighting and both of them dying, sort of, which is unexpected actually. Then you've got the two sisters. So you've got Antigone and Ismene. So Antigone is the one that is outspoken, but she's the one that cares for the father. So you already know that she has that caring. Now, Ismene is one who is a little bit overwhelmed by law. We have to, she says, doesn't she? We have to do as we're told. We're just girls.
Yes.
Do you know what? And let's face it. I think a lot of women were brought up with that, do told. And, my parents were refugees over here. And very often the power of the father is, do this, do that. Actually, do you know what? There's a part of me that I quite like the systems, the law. You do this, don't do that. Because I think as a child growing up, if it's not too tyrannical, it gives you boundaries. And if you break something, that you're breaking it for a reason, and it gives you something to do like that. If you give them too much leeway, you don't know where you're going. You can break a law, or not the police law or the legal law, but the laws. If you can break them, it makes you stop and reflect on what you're doing, basically.
Exactly. Yeah.
If it's too tyrannical, they can be dangerous. If it's a moderate law, it's just obeying and getting forward and moving forward from people who care. And this is why this is such a difficult and interesting subject, because Creon, who comes in, is not really a king here. He's not been trained. He's not practiced.
No.
So he
was not supposed to be a king to start with. He was just a caretaker.
So he really, I think he's like many people who get into leadership positions, intrinsically do not embody the knowledge of leadership, how to move forward. So therefore they attach themselves to these very strict rules because they don't know how to actually negotiate leadership. Absolutely.
And I think you can say that about a lot of people who they don't know how to lead, and they find themselves in position of leadership, and then they learn by trial and error. In the case of Creon, he learned big time by trial and error.
In such a devastating way, totally.
Exactly, such a devastating way and sad way, by losing his son, losing his wife, in many ways, losing his mind. I mean, there are indications towards the end of the play that he won't be able to bear what happened.
In a way, it's like King Lear, isn't it?
Yes, exactly.
Shakespeare took a lot of his plays.
Yeah.
Sophocles, please.
Absolutely, and I think there is something here about leadership, but also the sense of in many ways you can see Creon as trying to reinforce the laws of the city. I mean, there are clear laws that indicate in ancient Greece that if someone is an enemy of the city, will not be buried by the city. You know, but at the same time, this is a very gray area because there is a whole history of Polynices being really, a citizen, but you can argue whether he really betrayed or not his city, because Theocles he didn't keep his word in a
Yeah,
way.
so there was he had a righteous anger, if you like.
Exactly. But the way he went about enacting his revenge by siding with the enemies of the city in order to oust his brother and then put him in a position of power, that shows also that he's acting out of a position of ego himself, of not being a real leader himself, that he's not trying in a way to appeal to the citizens and the Thebans in a way, and for the sense of justice. He's trying to do that through power and force, and of course that leads to another tragedy. Both of them die, and then Creon takes over. In many ways, Creon is also an unwilling, and both willing and an unwilling leader. And he's simply following rules in a very absolute manner because, as you said, he wasn't supposed to be that in the first place. So when he came to power, he didn't know how to lead, and he follows a very absolute rule that this is the law of the city without any gray areas. We don't bury people who are traitors, who committed treason. End of story. And then Antigone challenges that because there are gray areas and there is ethics here that surpass the absolute sort of interpretation of the law, and we need to take them into account. And that's where the two sort of there is a wider symbolic structure that includes ethics, and there is the law.
And the divine law, because what she was fighting for, because unlike today's understanding of death and burial, because I think, recently death has we've become quite flippant with death. The right to sort of go to a clinic and just kill yourself. At that particular time, death was very important. How we were buried was super important to the soul. And we see that in Egyptian times, we see that in Indian. What happens to the person? And the fact that Polynesius was going to not be given that sacred element, the sanctity of burial, was very meaningful to his soul. And that's what she was standing up for. So not only her feminine power of, this is who I am, but also this is right. This is morally right for him. We have to do this for him, or he won't pass. He might go to Tartarus as opposed to Hades, or he might not go to, what is it, the Elysium Plains.
Yes, exactly. To the place where, is a kind of limbo.
Yeah. So he was left, he would eternally be left to struggle.
Exactly. So it's absolutely crucial for the ancient Greeks to perform these rites. Otherwise, the bodies need to be buried. Otherwise, they become ghosts. They stranded in this limbo type of region, and they don't go to the underworld, and they are completely they live a kind of very liminal existence between the two worlds where they don't belong to either of them. Their souls cannot rest. And I think this is very important. So there is a symbolic rite that needs to be performed for them to be able to pass to the other world. And if that is considered one of the worst ethical transgressions that someone can do, not to bury the dead,
Yeah, and that's why it's so terrible over here when COVID was happening and people couldn't spend time with their family members who were dying.
Yeah.
Bring it into today's world, just to respect that moment.
Absolutely. I think this is one of the worst sort of experiences that someone can have, losing someone who cannot be with them during the time of the death, and then the burial being done in a way that is quite inhumane and very brutal, and in some cases not even allowed to see the body, right? Or being put in a coffin with with nails and not being able to, you don't know whether you bury your family member or someone else completely.
Absolutely.
It could be an anonymous coffin with no indication of who is buried, and and whether we can mourn without seeing the dead. And I think this is a fundamental sort of crack on the symbolic system and the symbolic rites that we need to perform as a society in order to be able to rest on not only the dead but ourselves.
Absolutely, because I think this is why people come into therapy. So I do think there's an issue with power, because it's the power that was saying to people, and even today is saying, no, you can't do this and you must do that, and you can't go into church, or you can't. Everything is sort of rigid. It's given us, it's given a timetable, and I think that, but what it leaves people with is they are straddled between here and no man's land on that level, and I think that how it leaves people, and I don't think actually many therapists deal with this. They might deal with the death and the grieving of the death, but what it leaves people with is the residue of that feeling. There is a sanctity there, and we all have an internal sacredness, whether we like it or not, whether you admit it or not, it's there. And if you don't tap into it, that could be actually creating a lot more problems for people, whether it comes out in the physical world, in their physicality, the psychoid, the link between the mind and body, or the psychological stress that people are dealing with could be on this level as well.
I agree. I think there is, and I think Antigone's actions represent exactly that. Whatever authority has to say, this is not right.
Yeah.
And we'll have to follow the ethical command that belongs to the divine law. In many ways, you can see here as a religious fundamentalist, right? This is someone who's saying, no, I will not follow the law. There is a higher law here rather than following. But at the same time, it's very specific to specific actions. It's not disagreeing with the law of the city. It's disagreeing with a particular decision based on that law.
Exactly.
But actually, the law can be interpreted in different ways. And actually, Creon himself changes his mind, and towards the end of the play, he's convinced that his interpretation of the law was quite rigid. So he changes his mind, and he becomes more sort of pliable, and entertains the possibility of different solutions. But I think there is something else here. It's almost like she's obsessed with this. She's not going to give up or give in. She's going to perform that ritual, whatever the cost. And that is phenomenal. You don't see a lot of people acting in this way these days, unless they have found something which is really powerful, and and I think there is something quite appealing to that. What is it that we are willing to die for?
I had a conversation actually with a woman who was a sergeant or an officer in the army. And we were having a very casual conversation, and you know what it's like when you're a psychotherapist. People often gravitate to you, and you talk about things that are quite deep and meaningful. And she was in Afghanistan, and her role was to pick up the pieces of dead bodies, of dead soldiers, British. She was quite young. She was early 30s, absolutely amazing woman, totally. There was a spirit about her that was exceptional. The spirit of leadership, but the morality in the heart of somebody that was very, almost that divine aspect. She fully understood her role, but what she found very difficult was picking up the pieces of the dead bodies, bringing them together. And I said to her, I sort of mentioned the Indian culture, Hindu culture, where it's women that often deal with the dead. They prepare, and here we have Antigone being the woman preparing. I think it was the great saying in the Greek period, but mostly it's women that prepare the dead for burial. And I was telling her about the sacredness and the sanctity of that moment, and how the spirit is still with the body, and how important her role is. And that gave her immense comfort. And she had actually given up doing the job. And later, obviously, it took her a while, but later she went back to it. because I said, who better than you could do that job? Who else would have your care, understanding, your, sort of real understanding of not the religion aspect to it, not the religious aspect, because I think religion often gets in the way of the reality of the sacredness, but those last moments, the sacred of those last moments, where somebody needs somebody like her to put them back together, to bring them back to the coffin, to take them to the parents, almost that wonderful relationship that she had with the family was so powerful.
I think that's absolutely crucial. But you see, again, it's men that destroy bodies and kill and kill each other in a way, and women have to preserve the sacredness of the body.
I agree with you. I'm in two minds about that. I do think that women sometimes, not always, but sometimes are either blind to it or elect to allow the men to do it. Or they can ignite that part of a man. So I do think that we need to look at that now that women are becoming far more aware, and socially we're getting better at standing. In business you can do work. You're being, there's a lot more equality going on. Not totally, but will we ever be? We have to have differences in equality, and I don't want to go into sort of poor me syndrome of women. But there is something much more deeper that women have that is profound, but also they are the people that at this moment still give birth. I quite like that. And the power of a mother, they underestimate.
Yes.
The power of a mother saying, well done, son, you go there, which they did in the wars.
They did, yes. They supported. Yeah, they supported both mothers and girlfriends, wives. They gave the blessing, right?
Yes. So
it's not that they are exempt from this, but at the same time, there is something about there's something about respecting the dead that seems to. And how do you perform these rituals? How do we manage to find a space for that, and to space in our society which very quickly forgets the dead, and doesn't pay attention to the dead? And I think there is something which we can call it sacredness. I think there is something important because the dead are amongst us all the time, and they see us as well. I mean, all these generations that came before us, they see us, and we see there is a sense of having a presence of them, and we are entrusted with a power to redeem whatever injustice they suffered as well.
And also, I think it's at that moment of time, when somebody's dying, you can reconcile with them. And I have been around a number of people who died, and they never talk about how many yachts they've got, how many houses, how many shoes they've got, how many awards they've got. They only talk about relationships. I think this is crucial for people to understand.
Yes.
It's your relationships are key here, because that's all you will worry about on your deathbed. And often not only is the person who's dying that gets that, oh my goodness, what have I done?
Yes.
Brion, what was he thinking on his deathbed?
Absolutely. I mean, he was very alone in that deathbed. Like, all the people that he loved and were close to him, he lost. So in many ways, there is also, it's very interesting because the three plays it's about the curse of a family that is intergenerational. It goes through the generations, and they all suffer from that curse, which comes through Oedipus and passes to his children.
But there is something in that, isn't there? The transgenerational information that comes through.
That comes through, and they all, have a very horrible, tragic end, and they all suffer from this sort of double realization of, even Creon himself suffers from that realization that he only learns when it's too late, when already the damage was done. And perhaps there is some truth about a lot of us, that we only need to arrive at the place brokenness and damage before we can step back and realize what are we doing to ourselves.
I think, don't you think that's why I think therapy is so important? But to take, we've talked about taking therapy out to the masses, because not therapy per se, the one-to-one, but just the self-reflection. What am I looking at? What is my purpose? How do I look at my family? How do I look at myself symbolically? So if okay, let me ask you this. This might be something slightly left field, but I think you might quite like this. Imagine Antigone was your dream.
Was my
dream?
All right.
Okay, how would you perceive that? How would you see that? Or if a client came to you with a dream like that,
of Antigone, like
that style of dream.
Yes. I think I will see that, if they identify with Antigone, I will see that as a sense of real excitement and I mean, there is some meaning in their life. There is something they fight for. There is light at the end of the tunnel for them. There is something that they can hope for in that respect. But because, as I said, what is it these days that people are willing to fight and die for? I mean, sometimes,
Where's it gone? Where has it gone?
Where has it gone? And in many ways, it's like what becomes. She's so obsessed and so determined that this will happen that she won't stop at anything. And she goes back and re-performs the ritual. She didn't need to do it. I mean, there is a whole debate why she goes back and does it again. And a lot of people say is the fact that she cannot forgive herself unless there is a proper sort of, the earth stays on Polynice's body, and this is done properly, and so his soul will rest forever. And she sees it as her duty, but also as her obligation as a moral being, that I won't stop at anything until. You see, there is something quite admirable in this, and also quite scary, right? Yeah. Quite scary is that someone can go out. Scary. I mean, someone can go so far without. I mean, there is no conversation with someone like this, right? There is no sense of, what. I mean, Ismene is trying to convince her otherwise, and she's completely shut down. I mean, at the beginning of that's how it starts. The conversation between Ismene and Antigone, saying, "No, you shouldn't be doing that. You should be careful. What are you doing?" And she has a lot to lose, Antigone. I mean, it's not simply she's going to be married to Haemon. She will be a queen herself, because Haemon will take over the power eventually from Creon. So and so she's also not stopping, not at the face of punishment in the hands of Creon, but love cannot convince her otherwise. She loves him, and him loves her, and there is something that she's willing to sacrifice, even that, in order to to achieve that purpose. So it's almost like we can't quite conceive of that type of devotion these days to what is right.
Well, I don't know if that's true. I think, I really hear what you're saying. I mean, Ismene tried to take some of the blame, but she wasn't allowed to, because Antigone said, "No, you can't take the blame now. I did this. I stand for this alone," which is the very areas in astrologically. This is me. This is my voice. But I do understand, because if you have lost a family member, actually, sort of a brother or something, you're haunted by that person's life. If the person has not fulfilled their potential.
Yes.
I think it's understanding that she would be haunted. But, it's such a fascinating, because yes, you've got the determination, and I love that. Yes, I am going to stand up for what is right. And she doesn't know that it's right. She just knows this will happen. This is the law of the soul. Where does the soul go? And this is agreed by everybody in Greece. So actually, this is where it ends up. If you don't do this, this is why Creon sort of decreed that should happen. And it's so powerful that he decreed that. That is the biggest punishment you can have. It's not just being ostracized. It's like your whole world. This is forever, eternity.
Yes.
It will never stop. And perhaps her understanding that she had, because very often they say the feminine is borders between this world and the other world. You know, sort of, if you look at Hitler, and one of the biggest tyrants that we all know of, he had only women in he had a sort of temple, not a temple, sort of, a small temple up in the Alps, in the Bavarian, in his Bavarian castle, but he had women there that would be part of his entourage, if you like, the group that, you know, sort of evoked the viril energy, the energy of power. But I do think that, I mean, it's very well recognized, but not in this day and age. And I think female spirit, this is why people are getting confused with the feminine spirit. What is it as an entity? And I think the discussion here between Ismene and Antigone is such a big one to actually look at. And what you're saying about Antigone, what made her do that? Because perhaps it's the fact that she knew, if I don't do this, what's going to happen to him forevermore? And will she be haunted?
Yes. I think there is something about, there is a modern adaptation of this that I watched. It was a French movie. I can't remember now the title, but it was with a young a woman playing the role of quasi Antigone, of being a doctor working late, and someone buzzes the door and she doesn't open it, and she sees through the camera that is this black woman, says, please open the door, and says, well, she decides not to open the door because it's 5 o'clock and she needs to go home. She could have opened the door and she could have allowed her in, and then she finds the next day that this woman, which is, I think she was an adolescent, young adult, about 17, 18, she was murdered. And that haunts her.
Yeah, of course it does.
And for the rest of the film, she leaves her job. She's trying to find what happened to that woman, what happened after. She didn't open that door. She didn't, just because she obeyed the law. It's 5 o'clock. 5 and 1, we don't open the door to anyone, right? So she feels haunted by this. She feels guilty, and she can't get her off her mind. It just haunts her. She can't sleep. She can't think. And it's not. And then she finds who did who committed the. And actually, it was quite cathartic for the person who committed the murder, because they did it accidentally. They didn't want to kill her. They did it accidental, but the way it happened also, it just haunted them too. So when they confess, they go to the police and confess, it's almost like, now I can rest.
Yeah, absolutely.
Haunted by it either.
Don't you think that is within us all? That anxiety we have. I always think that, sort of, for me, my soul is like a river. And, or waters. Sometimes it's like a stream, and other times it's like a turbulent whirlpool. And if we don't recognize that, and it's a little bit of our soul talking to us, and that's what you're talking about here, it's disquietant and we can't rest. And I think this is what's happening to people. Once they talk about their soul a little bit more, they would understand why that's happening to them, what's haunting them, what's worrying them. And it may not be of what's happening to them now or around them, but it could be to do with a relative. It could be to do with something in the past.
Yes. But I think we have also found ways to deceive ourselves and to bring a false peace and quiet in our minds, in order to, and also to use several substances to do this.
Oh,
right?
It's so sad. It's so sad to see people who become reliant on substances, because they just take over, and also the boundaries between this mind and the delusional world.
And I think there is a lot about seeing what is happening in the world, killing off part of ourselves, or being haunted by things that have happened or we have done, or they have happened to us that are unfair and unjust. And I think a lot of addiction can be explained out of the pain of that disquietness and the attempt to anesthetize something. to anesthetize the pain that we experience,
Mm.
and the fact that we cannot just get things out of our head without using some powerful way to dissociate.
Yeah, and to cushion you, to make you feel better every day.
Yeah.
And maybe on one level, they just can't talk to people on a level that is meaningful to them. You know, and I think all that needs to be looked at in a slightly different way. But Antigone now, she's in the cave and she decides to take her own life.
She decides to take her own life, and that is, in many ways, is also an act of freedom, isn't it? It's like, I'm not going to be killed by, I will take. Although in many ways it's also seen, I mean, suicide in ancient Greece was not seen as an act against the gods. It was. It depends under the conditions in which you commit suicide, we take your life. It's whereas here it becomes, it's with Christianity, it becomes something that is against God's will, because God is the creator.
Yeah.
So you are going against God's will. Whereas in ancient Greece, it was perhaps an act of sometimes heroism, an act of altruism, like it is in Japan sometimes. It was, yeah, or an act of not succumbing to something that is unfair and unjust, and deciding is an act of freedom. And I think that's how I see it. In many ways, Antigone is representing someone who is in her obstinance and her quasi-autistic obsession with, I'm gonna do this, because I'm haunted and there is no way that I'm gonna back down. She represents a kind of very paradoxical type of freedom against authority, freedom against authority, tyrannical authority, especially.
So that is, sort of for her, and it's so sad if people feel that that's the only way out for them. And I'm sure under certain, and we see it in our world at the moment. At the moment, we are exposed to the whole world, which we never were before. And if you're exposed to the tyranny of certain leaders in our world, what is the other way out? If you're in a concentration camp, at which my uncle was, you do wonder, and through the wonderful writings of Solzhenitsyn, of course, and Victor, his surname will come, about finding meaning, is how do you get through those times? But they had other people with them, but she was isolated in her cave, and in one story they said she killed herself with her veil, her wedding veil. And it's just so tragic that she couldn't live that life. She couldn't get married. It was almost, but that is the feminine as well. If we look at the feminine as the feeling type, that's what Creon had done. He had totally killed his feeling type, his feelings. I can't even understand what's going on here. And I think the leaders that are tyrannical are just not in touch with their feelings.
No, I mean, in many ways, the feelings cannot be thought of. They just they are acted out. There is no mediation. There is no sense of processing anything. It's just complete evacuation of into action. It's not reflection. There's no reflection. There is nothing to process. It's just complete, from feeling to acting without any mediation, which is also quite dangerous. And in many ways, you can see his Creon's actions as a way of compensating for his own insecurity, the feelings of insecurity. He feels that he's not.
Which comes back to him absolutely having to stick to the law because it's not internalized. He's not a natural leader.
Yeah, and his feelings of inadequacy and insecurity. Right? And I think this is what the problem is with other, leaders in general. But I see that some of my male clients, that the moment they feel inadequate, they try to overcompensate by becoming aggressive and violent. And I'm saying, well, there is nothing wrong with accepting that you won't have to be adequate 100% all the time. Sometimes we don't feel adequate to the task. There is a certain humility and humbleness to accept that our limits and what we can do, and learn from that and brush against our limits so as to push our skill set even further. But the sense of feeling inadequate and the overcompensation through a sense of omnipotence.
Omnipotence, yeah.
Then, from being impotent to becoming omnipotent,
Yeah.
it becomes a real big issue. I often think that there is a very big danger with anyone. I mean, I'm talking about the masculine here, about keeping things up all the time. And I think, and I said, we are not, we shouldn't function as erect penises all the time.
Oh,
We are
quite.
not.
I know.
Yeah,
But we've
it's not.
changed. That's because we've changed in our world, haven't we? I mean,
Mm,
from that period of time when men were warriors and they went out to fight, even till recently in Second World War and
yes,
so on, we were constantly fighting, and there are wars still going on.
yes, yes.
But what is the value? And it's almost like people aren't looking inside and saying, what is the value of what I'm doing here? Why am I doing this?
Yes. And I also think that we are called upon to fight or to respond to demands to the environment, and when we do, we have to be prepared and do this. I mean, there are times that it is unavoidable,
Yeah.
of course. I mean, I'm not denying that aspect of the masculine, but there is something about doing it when it is not necessary.
Yes,
And
absolutely.
carrying that burden,
Yeah.
that mantle of masculinity as a heavy sort of mantle that actually is very oppressive and doesn't allow you time to relax and be yourself and be vulnerable sometimes without having to feel inadequate.
I think women are becoming more like that as well.
Well, I mean, it's characteristic. I mean, the phallus doesn't belong to either masculine or feminine. It can
That's
be
what I'm thinking. So,
yes, be something that can be possessed. It's across genders. So it's a symbol of power.
Yeah, the masculine energy is not being absorbed correctly for a lot of them. They're just stepping into the old roles. And I think that's quite dangerous. And I think time to reflect and look, what am I actually doing here? And that's why therapy with the right therapist. Say that. The right therapist is so crucial that they can take you down that path without, it's not, CBT is great at certain points, but the true transformation comes in that some symbolic transformation.
We talked about Tiresias, and it's very interesting because he's the only character in ancient tragedy and ancient mythology that he found a way to transform himself into a woman.
That's right. That's right. Yes, so he had both. And do you know what? Shamans, if you look in Siberia, my parents were prisoners of war in Siberia under the Russians. And yet I've had this yearning to go to Siberia because they have, in the depths of Siberia, they have ancient shamans. And shamans would always dress as the opposite gender when they were doing their spiritual work.
Yes.
And there is in that world, and I like that about that world, that we become this, we marry the two.
Yes, that's right.
Masculine and the feminine energies have to come together. The logos, the chaos, the eros, the logos sit together, and isn't that the ultimate?
Yes, of course. This is the process of integration, but at the same time accepting that sometimes there will be conflicts, but it's part of life.
Absolutely.
Right? Conflict is part of life, and they do not quite marry completely and fully, but at the same time, what marriage is without problems.
I know, but I think marriage is great. I'm, sort of a big fan of people being married. I always try to keep married couples together because, conflict within that means you're growing and you're blending and you're coming together. And I think it's a wonderful thing. And, but it's also that within ourselves.
Yes, I think this is what you imply. But I think for me, it's also, but he got punished by the gods for transforming himself into, that's why he was blinded.
There you are.
He wasn't supposed, a human being is not supposed to keep so much knowledge.
Yes,
they
but
were
they're
not
not allowed
envious
to
of
be
him.
divine in that way. But he's not he's not standing up to the gods and saying, I am a god. He opened that door for himself. When you are that close to combining the two, you take on a different element. Isn't that what individuation was meant to be? It's sort of the quantum physics of individuation, that you actually are in tune with the world at that point. And things start happening and you can see things. We're not, as I say, we're not talking about the seers, the mediums we're talking about, but real seers. See much more profound and much bigger, much more different. And that's who he was for people.
Yes, definitely. So yes, I think for me, there is something about the power of Antigone and the power of the feminine, and also having the power of the kind of the combination of the feminine and the masculine coming together, and inherent, the determination that gives her to say no and stand by this no and articulate it against the tyrannical power. And I think for me it's quite magnificent in that is represented in the tragedy, in the way it was represented by Sophocles as well, and it was left to us. But it will take people like this to fight injustice, in the sense of where there is no compromise, that what is right needs to be done and needs to be followed.
And there are amazing people that do that.
Absolutely.
And they are almost the saints of this world. They sacrifice themselves for that higher integrity. But I do believe it has an effect.
It has, yeah, definitely.
Yeah, and I think that is so powerful. I think.
Look, I mean, for Antigone, she destroyed her life and destroyed the life of her lover, and fiancé. Right? There's a huge impact, but then again, there is something that becomes bigger than her.
Exactly.
It's bigger than her, and the love, and and that's bigger. What is bigger is quite. I think that's why I think it's, on the one hand, admirable and majestic in its own right, but also quite frightening that we have that ability as humans, right, to transcend ourselves and actually reach what is bigger. And once we reach what is bigger, whatever we call it, symbolic, ethical, transcendental, then we are transponded and transferred into another realm.
Yeah, but we've got to keep bringing that back to earth. And how do we play it out
here? Exactly.
I think that's so important to remember that. So if we finish up now, because although it's fascinating, we can go on for a long time.
Yes, of course.
And we'll do another one. Is there anything you want to finish with?
No, I just wanted to recapitulate and reinforce this idea of how important it is for our times to listen to our conscience, do what is right, remember the dead, and we, as I said, we are entrusted with a sacred, almost, power to honor the dead and not to be haunted and the injustices that can be done to them. And so it's not simply the present and the living that they need to live under just conditions. I think if we don't do something about our life in the present, we are also letting down the dead, and we will be haunted by them. So there is something about Antigone that, and we need to bury them properly, and we need to symbolically give them a proper burial. And this proper burial will come only if, us living, we start to live just and properly ourselves.
So, and also understanding power. If you have power, know how to use it. And let's see where Tiresias is today.
Yes, we need more Tiresias. We need our prophets.
We do.
Which, of course, they exist in all sorts of traditions, including the Hebraic, and and it's about prophets. The prophets are they speak truth to power.
And that's what we need, and we all need to open our eyes and ears to listen and to see who they are.
Yes, exactly.
It's wonderful, actually, talking about Antigone and discussing the themes here. They're so powerful, and thanks for choosing this particular myth.
Oh, it was a real pleasure, Maria, and looking forward to continuing the conversation with other myths.
Let's do the next one.
Yes, absolutely.
Bye now.
Bye-bye.